Okay, thanks everyone for joining. Just a very quick introduction. Make sure they mute their microphone to avoid disturbances. That would be great. Andreas is going to give a 20-minute or so presentation, and then we have until 11 o'clock your time to ask questions. You can either do that by entering a question in the chat box you should see on screen, or you can send me an email. That would be easier. And yes, in answer to Eleanor's question, this is for Wednesday's print edition, Tuesday online at 0800 in the morning. And you should all have received embargoed material, including the UK country note now. Okay, I'll hand over now to Andreas. Please do mute your calls, your microphones.
Yes, hello. Pleasure to share the results under embargo with you. As Spencer just said, the embargo is until the 3rd of December, 8 o'clock UK time. Just a few words on the Pisa assessment itself. It's been the largest assessment, 600,000 students from 79 countries taking part. You can see them here on a map, and the focus was on reading. And this time, reading in the digital world. Obviously, the nature of reading has changed in important ways, and we try to reflect it in the design of the 2018 assessment. We also focus, include science, where students had to explain what they see in scientific terms, evaluate and design scientific inquiry, and also interpret information in scientific terms, and also demonstrate in mathematics that they can think like a mathematician. So those were the three areas covered by this assessment. There's a focus on reading. Target population is 15 to 16, and we are covering students full-time or part-time, enrolled in academic or vocational programs.
Someone has muted their microphone.
Part of it. There are some rules for exclusion that are very, very strict, and also what we can see is that most countries have actually met the 5% exclusion rules. The UK is just, on the border, but basically I think we're very satisfied with the sample and also the overall level of exclusion. Now, one question that always comes up actually is every 15-year-old taking part in the PISA assessment? And the answer is to the extent that they are enrolled in education, the answer is yes. But there are always some 15-year-olds in some countries who are no longer or not in school. Now you can see that on the right side of the chart, in Jordan, in Panama, in Baku, Azerbaijan, you have almost 50% or more of students who are no longer in school, and therefore they are not covered in the PISA assessment. Let me just give you an example also. The 4 provinces in China that took part, there are still in poorer areas some students not enrolled in school, but overall also there we can now say over 8 out of 10 15-year-olds are covered in those 4 Chinese provinces that took part. And in the UK it's around 85%, so close to the OECD average. So overall, for the vast majority of systems, we're very satisfied that we now cover the predominant population of 15-year-olds. Everybody's enrolled with minimal conclusions, so that we can be confident in the results that we publish. Now, coming to the result, and I focus on reading literacy. We started the assessment in 2000. In that time, reading was still predominantly on print text. Students had to sort of extract information from carefully curated, textbooks in school usually. But then around, 2003, we could see the emergence of technology, reading behaviors changing. But we haven't seen that translating, changes on average across OECD countries and reading outcomes. Now that's quite important. The world is changing, but students' literacy skills as measured by PISA on average across OECD countries did not really change. And then 2006, remember, that was the year before the iPhone was invented, the digital reader. And that's actually from that moment on, we have quite good trend data for the UK. Remember, in 2003, we did not have results for the UK. But since then, we can see how the world is changing and how reading skills are evolving. And you can see in either the UK or also on average across OECD countries, haven't seen that much real evolution. Now, the world continues to change, but education systems having a hard time keeping up with those kinds of changes. What we see in the last years, 2015, 2018, a positive trend in the UK, slightly so, not significant, but also a divergence from the OECD average, which continues to flatline. We have 11.5% British students who can distinguish fact and opinion in fairly complex situations. These are not simple tasks. Students have to basically use implicit cues that are either related to the content or the source of information. So quite complex tasks, but you have about almost 12% of students being able to do that. But at the same time, in a world in which that is a skill that you wish everybody would have, in a world of fake news, it is important for students to have those abilities. But we can see in the case of the UK that share has been slightly increasing over time, but is still modest. And so it is on average across OECD countries. You talk about 9% on average across OECD countries having those kinds of abilities. Now, let's have a look. This is the OECD average, and let's look at some other countries. Top performer are the 4 Chinese provinces, Beijing, Shanghai, Jiangsu, Zhejiang. They come out a good margin. Just Singapore gets close to that, and you can see also Singapore improving at a quite important speed. Among OECD countries, Estonia has moved to the top. Then we have also good improvements in Portugal, moving towards the OECD average. Also Poland, not so much in the last years, but in the early years of Pisa, seeing very significant improvements. At the low end of the performance scale, you can look at countries like Peru or Albania with significant improvements. Brazil and Turkey may not look so impressive in their improvement, but in the case of Turkey, coverage has almost doubled between 2003 and 2018, and that's quite impressive results. Turkey has got more kids in school and at the same time improved the quality of their learning outcomes. Last country I want to mention here is Sweden. That was a country where we saw a market drop in results in the early 2000s, but it's sort of catching the ball. You can see since 2012, we can see improvement. And that's actually quite, we can pinpoint that reversal in trend quite well when they reviewed their policy on school choice and equity, and really redoubled their effort to build better mechanisms of quality assurance and raising the status of the teaching profession into their system. So that gets you to where countries stand by now. On the right side is just the ranking of countries on the scale, and you can see how we got to that place. I'm not going to go through this in detail here. You can just see the countries in green that have seen good improvements in reading, math, and science. In yellow, and that includes the UK, countries where things have been more or less stable, and in that red, countries where we have seen declining trends, such as Australia, Finland, Iceland, Korea, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and the Slovak Republic. Just to sort of show you in a little bit more detail the trend in UK, you can see overall in reading stability, but between 2009 and 2018, you can see a small significantly positive trend in mathematics between 2015 and 2018. That's a significant increase. Whereas in science, since between 2006 and 2018, we have seen a decline, even though results are still better than the blue line, which is the OECD average. When you look at social disparities, here you can see learning outcomes by decile of social background. You can see the picture is similar across countries. Those from the most privileged backgrounds in the green triangle are doing better than those from disadvantaged backgrounds in the red dot. But what's interesting also is that there's huge variability across countries. When you look at the 10% most disadvantaged students in Beijing, Shanghai, Jiangsu, and Zhejiang, they do still as well as the average student in the UK. And same picture for Macau or so on. So some systems are doing remarkably well in giving even the most disadvantaged students a very high level of learning outcome. Variability in school performance is always a big indicator for us. To what extent does performance variation lie between students or between schools? And you can see the UK here fairly much on the left side, not as much as Finland, where you can say the closest school is always the best school. But what's also important is that actually, when you look at the share of variability in learning outcomes, just about 20% lies between schools. And I think that's an important kind of finding in the UK. So much discussion is always about, what school you choose. But actually, as you can see here from the chart, most of the variability lies within schools, not between schools. Big challenges for the UK lie in, there are many neighborhoods and many schools in which you can find significant shares of low performers, not just a few schools. If you go to the right side, to Israel, for example, there the picture would be very different, where actually once you choose the school, you have a pretty good idea of its overall performance. Now, how does the results relate to investment? You can see that the UK is pretty much where you would predict it to be, sort of spending per student and outcomes are more or less in line. And there is a relationship, but it's actually flattening out. We can see the same when we look at learning time. Here you have in blue learning time in school and in yellow learning time out of school. Big variability. You can look at the United Arab Emirates being #1 on this. Finland with the shortest school days and very little time for homework and private tutoring. But when you look at productivity, you can see that students in Finland or Germany or Switzerland or Sweden or Estonia learn a lot in very little time, whereas students in the United Arab Emirates spend a lot of time and learn very little. What you can see here is that the UK also comes out at an above average level of productivity. So learning gains per hour of instruction are quite good, significantly better than in the United States or even in Singapore. Singapore gets its good learning outcomes to a large margin by volume, not necessarily by productivity. So that's, I think, a strong point for the UK. Let me sort of move a little bit beyond the reading, maths, and science scores that you have just seen. We, for the first time, included a question on the student growth mindset. To what extent do students believe that success comes from effort rather than inherited intelligence? That's a very important concept, because if students do not see success in their own effort, in their own work, and probably they're not going to invest that much effort, particularly if they come from disadvantage. And you can see actually there is a cross-country relationship between the two. You can see Estonia comes out on top on growth mindset and very well on performance, but the UK too. Now, you can say students in the UK exhibit a growth mindset more so than on average across countries. And I think that's a kind of important point, and something that the education systems teachers seem to convey well to students in schools. We also see that the growth mindset is related to other things. For example, the motivation of students to master complex tasks, their confidence in their own abilities, negatively to the fear of failure, positively to the students' aspiration to ambitious learning goals, and also to the value they place on schools in view of their future lives. What I found interesting is that the growth mindset relates differently to different outcomes, different social groups. You can see, for example, the impact of growth mindset on reading performance is stronger for girls. Growth mindset seems to be matter more for girls. It's stronger for disadvantage. So coming from a disadvantaged background, growth mindset matters more, and also for students with an immigrant background. When you look at this by country, you can see also there that that relationship between growth mindset and reading performance is stronger in the UK than it is on average across countries. Some countries even more, but I think those are quite important. So again, I think it's an important and a positive kind of story. Now, we also looked at learning or at outcomes beyond academic ones, general life outcomes. One question that we ask students is the extent to which they feel a a sense of belonging at school. School is a place where I make friends, where I feel that I belong, sort of that kind of social grounding. And that's an indicator where the UK does not do so well. Now, that's a self-report from students, but it's something that is not very well developed. And it's actually an indicator that is also predictive for outcomes, particularly for disadvantaged. We also see that students in the UK express quite a low level of satisfaction with their lives. Again, you know, that's just an expression of their views. It's not a kind of normative measure, but you can see the UK comes out towards the lower end of the spectrum, and so does it when we ask students whether, you know, they find meaning in their lives. Also there, the UK is one of the last positions. Not sure what you can read into this or what the causes are, but these are aspects that we wanted to shed light on beyond the academic outcomes. The big question, of course, is always, you know, to what extent do schools make a difference? We're going to publish the major volume on this in June only, but let me highlight a few findings that come out from volume 3 that is going to be published tomorrow already now. The first point, positive picture for the UK. You can see students express that their teachers are generally supportive. They understand their learning needs. They can count on them when they have difficulties. They feel that teachers help all of the students in the class. So I think that's something that is quite positive. Students also perceive their teachers to be enthusiastic, you know, having a passion for what they teach. They feel that teachers like to teach those kinds of the students in the class, things like this. So that seems also to be really positive. And our data show that teacher enthusiasm and reading performance are actually related. The more students said that it was clear to me that the teacher liked teaching us, the better the reading outcomes. The more students said it was clear that the teacher likes to deal with the topic of the lesson, the better reading outcomes. So that's quite important. We also see that teacher enthusiasm was in an important way related to the disciplinary climate, and that's true across classrooms now. It seems that disciplinary climate is not just an issue of, you know, classroom management, but in very important ways also a correlate of greater teacher enthusiasm. Enjoyment of reading is something that we looked at. We can basically see students were more likely to enjoy reading when teachers were enthusiastic, when teachers stimulated reading engagement, when there was what we call teacher-directed instruction, sort of a fairly structured classroom setting, when students felt they were getting adequate feedback, when instruction was adaptive, sort of taking account of differences in student abilities, and when, again, students felt that the teachers were supportive. You can say, well, you know, maybe that's just an expression of the performance of reading, but even if you control for reading performance, you can find a similar relationship. So it seems that, again, you know, teaching practices are not just related to outcomes, but also the extent to which students really enjoy learning. When you do a regression across countries, you can see where principals said teachers not meeting individual students' needs is hindering learning. Outcomes were lower. Teacher absenteeism related to lower outcomes. Teachers not being well prepared for classes, according to the views of principals, also a negative predictor. Teachers being too strict with students, and so on. These things were related negatively. Students' life satisfaction, coming back to those social outcomes, they also relate to the school climate. And we found that really important because you might think student life outcomes, life satisfaction is something to do with, you know, it has nothing to do with school. But in fact, you can see disciplinary climate was an important predictor of students being happy with their lives. The absence of bullying, this sense of belonging, not very well developed in the UK, but was a very important predictor for student life satisfaction. Teacher support, teacher feedback. So that's something that might be worth looking in more detail for the UK, given that life satisfaction is low. You can see actually that school seems to matter quite a bit, not just for academic outcomes, but also for students' life satisfaction. We also see a positive relationship with a cooperative climate in classrooms, at the extent to which students feel that cooperation among them is valued by the school, by teachers, and a little bit also by competition. And you can see really how that varies across countries. You go to the left side of the chart, to countries like the Netherlands, Denmark, Japan, Germany, you can see how student cooperation is dominating according to what students say. On the right side, and that's where you find the UK, also Brazil, United States, Morocco, Malta, you can see that's where the competitive climate of student learning is dominating. And you could see just in the slide before that actually cooperation is actually more positively linked to the life satisfaction of students. When you look to reading performance, it's slightly different. Student cooperation is also a strong predictor for better reading outcomes, but you can say this to slightly lesser extent also towards competitive practices. So in one way, you can say both cooperation and competition are conducive to better reading performance, while cooperation is the better predictor for the life satisfaction of the students. Internet use, you can see on this chart that extreme or even high internet use tends to be related negatively to a student's positive feeling. And I'm talking here about basically spending more than 30 hours on the internet, and you can see basically in virtually, whether students are less happy, less lively, feel less proud, less joyful, less cheerful, feel more scared, more miserable, more sad. So on high internet use is clearly one of the kind of negative predictors. Let me sort of turn back once more to the issue around social inclusion. The one thing I wanted to really show you, because I think it's quite significant, is that imagine you have high-performing students only. And if high-performing students are disadvantaged, you can see here that they are much less likely to expect to move on to higher education than if they come from a privileged background. And that's, I think, a really important kind of finding, because this is not, disadvantaged students being low performers and therefore not wanting to go on to higher education. In this chart, I only show you the high performers. So basically, advantage and disadvantage matters a lot when it comes to, do you see education as your future, even when you are doing really well? I didn't talk very much about gender differences. The pattern there is pretty consistent with preceding surveys. Boys do less well in reading, boys do a little bit better in mathematics, and on science they do more or less even with girls. But when you look at career expectations, you can see real differences. For example, when you look at the top performers in mathematics or science, so those students who are very well kind of destined to go into the sciences, you can see boys are much more likely to want to go into science occupations than girls. And that's true virtually in most of the countries here. So while schools seem to have done a good job in moderating the gender differences in learning outcomes, when it comes to seeing science as something that opens your life opportunities, you can see still an important gender gap. Briefly on immigration, that's, I think, very positive outcomes, different from most other countries. Students with an immigrant background, both in the first and second generation, score only marginally less well than students without an immigrant background. Again, that's, I think, something the UK can be proud of. Particularly in the second generation, it seems that those students have caught up with everyone. Nevertheless, if you look at overall disadvantage, you can see that students from a disadvantaged background in the UK and elsewhere are less likely to have that growth mindset, less likely to have positive feeling, less likely to have a greater sense of life satisfaction, sense of belonging, more exposed to bullying, more exposed to poor disciplinary climate, less exposed to teacher enthusiasm, and a cooperative learning climate. So the odds are stacked against the disadvantage. That's true for the UK. It's also true for other countries. There are very few sort of real exceptions. For example, growth mindset. You can see Chinese kids from disadvantaged backgrounds still exhibit more of a growth mindset than children from privileged backgrounds. Polish students from disadvantaged express a strong sense of belonging, and when it comes to teacher enthusiasm, countries like Morocco or Israel or Panama still have high levels of teacher enthusiasm perceived by students even from disadvantaged. But generally speaking, it's very clear that education systems have to do more to give a more conducive environment to the students who need it most. And that's one thing that we also measure scientifically. Here you can see an indicator of resilience. This is a share of disadvantaged students who score in the top quarter of reading performance in their own country. And you can see in the UK, that's 40%, and that's better than the OECD average. Those are sort of disadvantaged students who succeed against the odds. And we also see again that this is, quite closely related to growth mindset. So what seems to sort of contribute or be conducive to greater resilience is that kind of growth mindset. When you look at, you just saw before that immigrant students in the UK succeed quite well. Across countries, you can also see their important relationships. Parents' emotional support was a predictor of, immigrants, disadvantaged immigrants succeeding well on the Pisa assessment. Teacher enthusiasm, sense of self-efficacy, strong disciplinary climate, cooperative climate, and again, the growth mindset. So you can see actually some of those factors are quite predictive of immigrant students succeeding despite coming from a disadvantaged background. Now, a couple of words on school systems. You can see that what we call isolation of disadvantaged students is not as pronounced in the UK as in many other countries. In other words, students from disadvantaged backgrounds have a higher probability in the UK to get into high achieving schools. I think that's a positive finding. If you go to the right side of the chart, basically the odds of ending up as a disadvantaged students in a high performing school are very low. I think this is something that works quite well in the UK, different from other countries. Nevertheless, when it comes to aligning resources with needs, more can be done. You can see the UK, like most countries, is on the negative side of the chart, where disadvantaged schools also suffer more from shortage of education staff, according to the principal, and also from greater shortage of the educational material. Now, that's something, of course, there have been efforts like the pupil premium to reverse that. But as you can see, the UK is still facing great challenges on this, as do most other countries. Now, wrapping all of this up, when you look at learning outcomes on the vertical axis in reading, and when you look at relative equality, and to what extent has the system been successful to decouple social background and learning outcomes, you can see the UK in the green quadrant, now basically showing that it's possible to reconcile quality and equity at a moderate level. That's all I wanted to share with you, and I look forward to your questions.
Andreas, could we get a bit more comment on maths and science in the UK? One seems to be improving, one's going down. What's happening?
I'm going to bring that back to you just a second. You can see that on the
and part of that question really is, does this mean that the UK is not changing much, but in fact other countries are going downwards? Or is it just modest progress?
In the case of reading, that's what you could say. In fact, I also would say between 2009 and 2018, you do see a positive trend. You're talking about 10 points on the Pisa scale. That's a quarter of a school year, and it's statistically significant. So slight positive trend and a downward trend on average across countries. I think that reading in the digital world is quite a challenge for students in many countries. And in mathematics, I would also say it's a kind of not so significant when you compare it with 2003. It's more or less, flat in the long run. But if you look in the more recent, sorry, I don't think my screen is yet anymore. But in the trend that is clearly negative is in science, where you can see sort of since 2006 things are sloping downward. So that's the overall picture.
And could you say a few words about England's performance compared to the UK as a whole for the reading, maths and science?
Actually, I don't have a slide on England's performance, but you do find that in the report.
Okay, it's pages 257, everyone. It's Annex Table B2.
Yeah.
Another question about East Asia, which is still home to the top performers. Could you talk a bit about the reasons for its success and whether you think the Western countries can catch up?
Yeah, I think there's several factors that we can learn from East Asia. I think the first is the success of those countries with disadvantage. I think their capacity to attract talented teachers to challenging classrooms, to align resources with needs, not just in terms of quantity, where we focus in the West, but really in terms of quality. I think is a great strength of the systems over there. The alignment of careers, teacher careers, with going through disadvantage, the significant time that teachers spend with students outside the classroom setting. British teachers have less time for other things in teaching. Those teachers in East Asia actually spend a significant share of their time working with students outside classroom settings. I think the focus on mastery learning is important. Teachers in East Asia, teachers in East Asia would rarely level down the horizon for a student with lower performance expectations, but they would redouble their effort, the pathway for students to achieve success. So very strong, consistent performance expectations across the school system. I think all of those things are ones which we can see really very positively pronounced in those kinds of education systems.
Okay, and then here, and there's a question on China. I think the answer is very clearly that the sample of the four Chinese economies is not meant to be representative of the countries, but I'll let you clarify that. Is the sample a proper cross-section and representative of the country as a whole?
These are four relatively wealthy provinces, even though their GDP per capita is way, way below that of the United Kingdom. So in OECD terms, you can still consider them poor countries, but relative in China, they are, the eastern, relatively well-developed provinces. That's, I think, something they should not be considered typical for China. But this being said, they represent about 180 million people in, each of these provinces is like an OECD country in terms of population size and a little bit poorer, but I think that's what I would say, but certainly not representative of China.
Okay. Well, for the moment, no one else has sent me any questions, so I don't know if in the meantime, if there's a bit more on science in the UK, Andreas. There's been a big push in this area, but we're not yet seeing the results. Is there any connection with that and getting expert teachers in this subject?
That's very hard to say. I mean, that's not something that we can see from the Pisa result. What you can see is that the slide in science result is not a recent phenomenon. It's something that we have been observing essentially, since 2012. It is hard to get good science teachers. Clearly, that's a very competitive field. That's something, shortage of science teachers, something that many countries facing, but it's very hard to link that directly to the observed PISA results. We do not know to what extent this has to do, with the teachers or the teaching. I think that's very hard to sort of figure out from the data here.
Okay, because just to clarify to everyone, I think when you normally talk about how long it takes for the impact of significant reforms to filter through into PISA scores, you normally talk at around a decade. Is that not true?
Yeah, it depends very much on what you do. If you, change something in early childhood education, you're talking about 5-year-olds. It's going to take 10 years until you could possibly see it in PISA outcomes when those kids are 15-year-olds. Some reforms, structural reforms, could have a shorter impact. You know, when Poland changed the structure of its schooling system in 2000, you could see that impact, or much of that impact, already in 2003. Similarly, many of Germany's reforms that focused very much on system design, on support systems, we could see sort of impacts in 3 and 6 year periods on the PISA assessment. But when you think about, you know, changing teacher education, for example, that will only feed very gradually into the teaching force. So you're going to see this in the very, very long run. It's very, very hard sort of to make a direct link between what we do and what we achieve on the PISA.
Sorry, I was myself on mute there. So, how large do differences need to be in PISA marks within or between countries or over time to be considered statistically significant?
Yeah, that depends on many factors. It depends on the size of samples, on the standard error. But what you can see here, for example, in the case of the UK, we can detect 10-point difference quite well. Now, that's something that I think is in the case of the UK, which has quite, you know, robust samples, also quite large samples, 10-point score points, and that's about a quarter of a school year. Those signals are significant at a very high level of confidence. At the OECD, we are very kind of conservative. We only show things that are significant if this is a 95% confidence level. Now you could apply more lenient standards and you can detect smaller differences, but at that, you know, very high threshold, 10 points is a good kind of figure to look at. Obviously, you know, for the OECD average, much smaller differences are significant because you have just lots of more students.
Okay. And then if we look at OECD trends over time, there's a reference on page 19 to the average rate of change in performance per 3-year period. We haven't really seen much improvement. The question is that a failure of PISA itself? Wasn't it supposed to support improvement in outcomes? And if not, what is it that's holding back progress?
Yeah, you know, I think that's a very good question. What is very clear is that the world around us is changing much more rapidly than the capacity of students, you know, particularly when you look at students being able to distinguish between fact and opinion. In the year 2000, you know, that might not have been such an issue. Students might not have been exposed to those issues to the extent they are today, but today it's a major issue. So if in 2000 you had 7% of students being able to do that at a high level, that might have been okay. If today you have 9%, a little bit more, being able to do that at this level, that's clearly, you know, a challenge. So I think, you know, what we can conclude that the rate of change in education clearly has not been in line with the rate of change in the environment and society and the demands placed on the skills of young people. That being said, you know, the education systems also face an uphill struggle. We can see clearly in many countries, social diversity has increased. The share of students with an immigrant background has increased. So clearly, in many ways, the environment has become more challenging. School has many more competitors when it comes to student learning time. You know, digital media taking up significant space in the lives of people with, as you could see, often negative outcomes. So the environment for schools has been more challenging. Now, when it comes to the effect of PISA, I'm more optimistic. You know, the countries that have really taken notice of PISA and done something with it have achieved a lot. You know, my own country in the year 2000, big PISA shock, you know, a lot of disappointment, but you could see that translated into action, and ultimately you could see significantly better outcomes in PISA. Same for Poland. You know, big reform in 2000 after the first PISA wave, and you could also see actually improvements over time. Or Portugal. Now, some countries where you see sort of more nuanced features, Korea, for example, also there. You know, they were quite, you know, they had very strong overall results, but they were not happy with the share of students being able to resolve and manage open-ended tasks. They worked on that. They could see an improvement in that share. So actually, I would say that where countries take notice of their outcomes and look at, you know, best performers across countries, you could see positive changes. I would also say, you know, the United Kingdom, its effort to learn from East Asia in mathematics education, maybe that is, also one of the factors that is contributing to the improvement that you can see over the last years in the assessment. It's very hard to sort of pinpoint this, but I would think where countries look upward, they're going to find the results on PISA are never a surprise. They are a reflection of what countries do, and I think that's the bottom line for me.
Okay, if you had to give a top line sort of description of the UK's progress, how would you describe it? Would modest progress be an appropriate description? And also, what is it that other countries are doing that the UK isn't? What are if you could highlight 3 things the UK could do to improve its performance, mainly in reading?
Yeah, I overall I must say I think we can talk about signals of progress, and I'm not just talking about the outcomes here. I also think sort of students' perception of the learning environment, disciplinary climate, teacher support are going in the right direction. So I think these are positive indications overall. You could say that you would want to compare the UK with the most advanced education systems, not with the OECD average. So I think there is every reason for the UK to look forward, to look towards further improving its overall performance. If you ask me, several things, I think the quality of education will never exceed the quality of teaching. And again, British teachers have less time than teachers in most of the highest performing education systems to, invest in high quality research and the, improvement of classroom practice in a collaborative culture. I think those are areas that in the long run will be very, very important for success. In a way, the British school system gives teachers and school leaders quite a lot of responsibility, but I think could do more to invest in the capacity of the school system to take that responsibility and deliver the kind of superior outcomes that we see in the highest performing education systems in Asia. But you can also look to, Estonia is a great example that, despite a very difficult financial situation and a very diverse social context, as we consistently seen progress. So again, I think there are good reasons to see scope for further improvement.
And what would you say is behind Estonia's success?
That's a very interesting question. I think Estonia shares many of the similarities with as Finland's education is a very dynamic education system, a system where schools have a lot of room for maneuver, but at the same time, schools are very well connected. And that's, I think, a big difference to the UK, where schools are less outward looking. They're more sort of looking upwards to external measures of accountability. You don't have so many of those in Estonia. Collaboration comes more, it's more intrinsically a feature of the system. You have certainly a very strong emphasis on teachers, despite relatively low teacher pay. That's actually really interesting. Estonia certainly isn't making teaching financially attractive, but it has been successful in making teaching intellectually attractive, attracting great people into the profession, giving them a really interesting work environment, lots of responsibilities. So it's a very nimble education system, not putting schools through very complex evaluation procedures, but being very acutely aware when things go wrong.
We have one just now looking at volume 3 about well-being at school and belonging. How predictive is it of academic outcomes?
You could see actually quite significant relationships between students' sense of belonging, even their life satisfaction, and academic outcomes. But I would not only look at those variables as predictors for cognitive outcomes. We have looked at them in volume 3 also as important outcomes in themselves. So if you, that's this kind of well-rounded kindness of students. Now, can you achieve good academic outcomes and at the same time also good life outcomes? Again, Estonia is a poster child where you can see actually all 3 dimensions being quite well developed.
Okay, we have you earlier you said you didn't have the details on England, but if I could, and I guess the same would be for commenting on Wales. Would you have any comment?
Yeah,
if I could just tell everyone that it's the NFER that has the country reports for the Wales, Scotland, England and Northern Ireland. So ask Maddie Wheeler at the NFER for their reports. But one question related was, do you consider the 4 UK education systems as broadly similar, or do you see any fundamental differences? Could you answer
That's an
that?
interesting question. You know, I think within the UK, you would see them as very, very different. If you look at the results, they are sort of broadly similar. You don't see sort of that kind of, I mean, Wales trails a little bit behind, but actually at the same time, I think also has seen some positive trends. I don't think that, you know, from an international perspective, I would look at them as different as you might do this from within the UK context.
Okay. Do we have any? We have a well. It is, I guess it's as I think we're all aware. There's an election happening in the UK, and it may give people cause to try and score political points from these PISA findings. What would your message be to those in terms of the UK's longer term performance?
You know, I think, you know, educational outcome, one of the lessons that I learned from across the world is that education improves where there is a long-term agenda, where there is an agenda that is not framed in political terms, but in substantive terms, where there is an agenda where the stakeholders in education, you know, teachers and school leaders play a very, very important role, where education systems, you know, don't engage teachers and school leaders in the design of change. Those will rarely help with implementation. So I actually think the less, and again, you know, it's a lesson we can take from Estonia. You know, you do have elections in Estonia, but you do have a shared belief in the main features of the education systems that are debated, but not on the back of teachers and schools.
Okay, don't seem to be getting any more questions. I think we've talked about Estonia a bit, but maybe there seems to be an awful lot of interest in Estonia's improvement. If you could give just two things, perhaps, that others could look for in Estonia, other countries could
Yeah, you know,
learn from
again,
Estonia.
if you come with a kind of British lens into Estonia, look for the nimbleness of the education systems. You don't find, you know, a heavy, you know, accountability system in Estonia, but you find a lot of intelligent and dynamic accountability in the system. You know, teachers knowing what other teachers are doing, schools knowing where they stand, level of competition in the system that is actually very productive, that schools collaborate and compete at the same time, where the Ministry of Education is actually quite closely connected to schools and will support them wherever they encounter kind of difficulty. So I think that's actually something that you could learn a lot from that very dynamic feature of the education systems, a high degree of professionalism. And last but not least, I think a very, very strongly developed culture of early childhood education and care. And that's maybe the big difference to Finland. You know, Finland is struggling as the student population is becoming more diverse. That has not been an issue in Estonia. In Estonia, the student population is diverse, but the system builds very strong foundations in the very early years. A very well developed early childhood education and care system, less sort of schoolified than England, less focus on cognitive learning, greater emphasis on social emotional development of small children, but still, I think the foundations are very, very strong. You know, schooling only starts at age 7 in Estonia.
Okay. Yeah. Another question a few people are asking is about the investment. We've seen an increased investment over the past decade in OECD countries, and yet a stagnation in the PISA scores. How do you think you can explain that?
You know, that it's not so difficult to explain. You know, it's like in most bureaucracies, so systems tend to get more expensive over time as salaries increase and so on, because the production function hasn't really changed. Now, we haven't seen really people working differently. We also seen lots of investment going into things that are not necessarily related to improved outcomes, you know, in smaller classes or in teacher assistants. Now, those have actually absorbed pretty heavy parts of the spending increases, but I would not call those investments the most productive use of resources. The most productive resources are the ones that go directly in what happens in the classroom, you know, in the quality of teaching and the exposure of students to, you know, great teaching practices. And often they are not, you know, those that have the short-term wins, and they are politically attractive. So I don't think the kind of loss in productivity that we have seen across the OECD countries is so much of a surprise.
Okay, and you've got one here about fake news. How far can you directly link top Pisa reading scores to students' ability to interpret fake news? This is the
That's a
fact
good
and
point.
opinion.
If you look to level 5 and particularly level 6, there students demonstrate that they can actually read and interpret text in very nuanced ways. They can, detect the hidden meaning of a text. They can, identify and relate sources of information. I think level 5 and 6 are the ones where you can be confident that students, find their way through a lot of ambiguity and fake news. At lower levels, students may detect simple kind of falsifications, but you get more worried. I actually think, in the reading world in which we live today, you really want all of your students at those high levels, particularly on this aspect of, triangulating different sources and navigating ambiguity. I think this is an area where you would want to see much better results in England and everywhere.
Sorry, mute. Another one here, which is about at this rate of progress, how long would it take the UK to catch up with the top 5 nations?
Well, that's the question. If you are on a Portugal, it's going to be, less than a decade. If at the current rate of progress, it's going to take a very long time.
Okay. Given the success of other countries over the UK, do you agree that more money for schools will increase our scores, or is it not about just more money?
Well, I think again, the UK comes out, the spending in the UK is pretty well in line with the results as measured here. I do think, the UK needs to think hard about how to invest its resources best and how to, better, align resources with needs. Maybe a more flexible and responsive financing system will be more important than just more money. Also, investment that goes into the quality of teaching rather than just the number of people working in schools. I think, I would not just say it's about more money, but it's about better spending. At least, that's a lesson you can learn from Estonia. They spend a lot less and achieve a lot more.
Okay. Would you say, how do you, your sense of the scale of the progress of the UK, given that some scores are going up and some scores are going down, would you say it's still a positive result for the UK?
Yeah,
PISA 2018?
I think there are positive signals. I would clearly say that, on the cognitive aspects, reading and math. I think on some of the classroom environment variables, I do think that, I don't think this is a big sign of progress, but I think these are positive signals that, there is momentum in the system.
The other one, which is about top PISA scores in East Asia, are they really the best measure of educational success, given the concerns about creativity and cramming? Maybe you could talk a little bit about the balance between academic achievement, but the importance of the other social aspects.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting question that you raise. But when it comes, for example, to cramming, I would, think that's more prevalent in the UK than in countries like Singapore or the 4 provinces of China. Actually, the capacity of students in those regions to deal with ambiguous, complex information, to think creatively about solutions, to navigate fake news is actually a lot better than in the case of the UK. So I don't think we should, stereotype the systems too quickly. That might have been true 20, 30 years ago, but if you look at classrooms there today and, the PISA results first and foremost, those countries have actually, cut that curve and actually are now developing very sophisticated skill sets among their young people that involve, complex problem solving skills, creative skills, critical thinking skills at a greater rate than you might think. The area where those countries need to work harder, but so does the UK, is to strengthen life outcomes. So like in the UK, life satisfaction, sense of belonging in many of the East Asian countries are not well developed. And I do think that's an area where those systems need to work harder. But when it comes to cognitive outcomes, even complex cognitive outcomes, don't underrate. Don't think, just because East Asia, follows a more teacher-directed style, that this results in poorer quality of learning outcomes. That's not what we see on PISA.
Thanks, Andreas. For the moment, I don't see any more questions. I can take the opportunity to tell people I'll be able to send around the PowerPoint later today, which is a big file, 16 meg file, and also towards the end of the day there'll be a recording of this webinar, which again I will be able to send you a link to. So
Very good, thank you very much.
Great, thanks Andreas.
Thank you.